Hello everyone, and welcome to this high-level lecture hosted by RECONNECT and organized in partnership with the America-Europe Fund at the University of Leuven. This webinar is part of our series on democratic and rule of law backsliding, causes, consequences, and prospects from around the world. In this global webinar series, we take stock of major developments with regard to rule of law and democratic backsliding in specific countries and regions around the globe. The RECONNECT project is an EU-funded Horizon 2020 project on reconciling Europe with its citizens through democracy and the rule of law, bringing together 18 academic partners from 14 countries. Its aim is to understand and provide solutions to the recent crisis faced by the European Union, from the most flagrant cases of democratic backsliding to the more complex and confused disconnect and waning trust between the EU and its citizens. So this global webinar series was specifically developed to also look at developments outside Europe, beyond the primary focus of RECONNECT. The America-Europe Fund at the University of Leuven is a new initiative by the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, aimed instead at contributing to greater comparative knowledge and stronger mutual relations between the US and the EU. So it is not by chance that we have invited today two distinguished experts from both sides of the Atlantic to showcase how important and valuable such conversation, bringing together European and US perspectives, really are. Professor Kim Lane Scheppele joins us from Princeton University, where she is Lawrence Rockefeller Professor of Sociology and International Relations. Her research interests have straddled the Atlantic for over 2 decades, focusing on constitutional systems under stress, like Hungary, Russia, but also more recently, the United States. Professor Gabor Halmai joins us instead from the European University Institute, where he is Professor of Comparative Constitutional Law. So his expertise is in constitutional law, international human rights, with a particular focus on rule of law crisis in Hungary, but also Poland and beyond within the European Union. Today's conversation, entitled Democratic Backsliding in the United States and Europe, Causes, Consequences and Prospects, focuses on how liberal democracies increasingly seeming regress where they were long thought to be most securely established. So our speakers will discuss some of the causes and consequences of democratic backsliding in the United States and some European countries, highlighting similarities and differences among governments shifting closer towards authoritarianism. We will start with Kim, who will provide us with an overview of the current situation or recent developments in the United States, and then we will move to the conversation with Gabor, who will then give us an overview of developments in Hungary more specifically. This conversation will be followed by a Q&A with you, the audience, so please do send us your questions via the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. And now it's my pleasure to give the floor to our first speaker. Kim, you have the floor.
Terrific, thanks so much. And I'm going to show slides. I think, yep, you can see them. So first of all, I want to thank RECONNECT. I feel like I've been a fellow traveler with RECONNECT from the beginning. And when this all started before the pandemic, I was completely focused on Europe. But now that I've spent 15 months in my house in the United States, I've become more of an expert on the United States. So today, by sort of popular demand, I guess, I'll be talking about this question, you know, sort of how to elect and keep an autocrat. Because often when we talk about democratic backsliding, we don't discuss sort of how the autocrat that is channeling the backsliding got into power. And so that's what I want to address today. So first, you know, these people that I call sort of new autocrats are appearing all over the place. And Gabor and I have been both, studying, of course, Hungary, but also Poland. This is happening not uniquely in Europe. Now it's coming to the US. And so what you realize is that this is part of a kind of general movement. And in fact, the Varieties of Democracy report, has been tracking this. And really in the last decade, the number of states going backwards, as it were, on all of these kind of democratic and human rights indicators has really gone up a lot. But what's striking, and this is the point I want to emphasize in my talk today, is that the way that democracies are failing have changed. So it used to be the case that usually fragile democracies would be overthrown by a coup. Now they're being overthrown by elections. And again, the general point I want to make today is that very often the first election in which an autocrat comes to power is free and fair, but there's a set of weak opponents. There's a special circumstance that allows the autocrat to sneak through. And then after that, the autocrat changes the rules and elections stop being free and fair. So this goes to the question, which if you walk into a bookstore, like this is what you see, right? A million books on populism. And the usual argument about why democracies are backsliding is because the people have given up, on democracy. And there are all kinds of reasons why. So the standard arguments are that, there are people who've been left behind by economic dislocation. Fake news is dominating the airwaves, so people are voting on the basis of ignorance. People are afraid of immigrants, terrorism, threats to identity. There's an anger at old elites. In the US, just flat out racism. So in general, when the topic turns to elections, then the question is, what's wrong with the people? Okay. And I want to flip the lens a bit because the new autocrats do run on these populist platforms. But the question is what voters are actually voting for when they vote for populists. And what I want to do is make this a more structural kind of conversation by saying you can't understand what happened in these pivotal elections when autocrats come to power unless you look at the choices that voters actually had and the rules under which the elections were run, right? So the question is really, did the people vote for autocracy? Did the voters intend what their leaders actually wound up doing? And is there some structural problem? Is there some democracy deficit that is built, coughed, democracy deficit that is built into the rules? And this goes to the question of the democratic legitimacy of elections, which I think is more in doubt than the democratic legitimacy of the people themselves. Okay, so the election of Donald Trump, I'm going to talk about the US and then Gabor will talk about Hungary, shocked everybody. These were just a couple of the magazine covers, that kind of reflected the, oh my God, what just happened? It came as a surprise. But the conditions for something like this to happen had been present for a long time. This is a set of Gallup polls going back to the 70s. The light green line shows you the percentage of the American public that says it's dissatisfied with the way the nation is governed. And sort of after 9/11, this number really spiked. There have been substantial majorities, and this is regardless of who's in the White House, right? So the trend doesn't go up in Republicans and down in Democrats. It's been just steadily rising, the dissatisfaction with government as a whole. And there's also been, a kind of interesting set of trends with regard to satisfaction with the candidates who are running for president. So this is a chart that shows you, this is Pew Research data. The blue line shows you the percentage of people who identify as Democrats who like the candidates on offer in any given election. And the red line shows you the people who identify as Republicans liking the candidates on offer. And one thing I want to focus on today is that the election of 2016 was an election in which there was not majority support on either side for the candidates that eventually wound up running in that election. And that really matters a lot. And it hadn't happened since the other Clinton ran in 1992. So 2016, when Trump came to power, presented what I think of as a kind of perfect storm of anti-opponent voting. So the top, this is Reuters Ipsos data, so the top line asks people who already said in that survey they were going to vote for Trump, like, so why are you voting for Trump? And, about half of Trump's voters said the main reason was that they didn't want Hillary Clinton to win. Less than half of the people who picked Trump said that it was because they agreed with him, right? So it was anti-opponent voting. And the same was happening on the other side. So here's among people who said they were going to vote for Hillary Clinton, why are you voting for her? You know, again, almost half say, I just don't want Donald Trump, and less than half agreed with her, right? So interpreting an election like this has to be done in the context of asking, like, who's the opponent, right? And therefore, what happened? So we know what happened, which is that Clinton won. Actually, she won by 3 million votes. On election night, it was clear she won by 2 million votes. By the time all the votes were counted, she had won by 3 million votes. So it was a close call, but in any sane country, that would have meant that she would have become president. Because in general, we think, you know, the popular vote is what determines the presidency. Well, not in the US, right? So in the US, the way that we run elections is unusual. We don't run one national election. We run 50 separate elections in the separate states. And in almost all states, it's a winner take all within each state. And what you win are those numbers of votes, which add up to something we call the Electoral College, right? And so the Electoral College at the moment means that what you see is this vast red is Trump and blue is Clinton. What you see is this vast number of states that vote for Trump. And these are states that don't have a lot of people in them, at least many of them. And that's why it's possible for somebody who doesn't win the popular vote to win the electoral vote, because states get votes kind of as states. And this is tilted against popular vote winners in cases where you've got what you have now in the US, which is that the Democrats are concentrated in the big states, the states that have a lot of people, and the Republicans are concentrated in the states that have fewer people. And when you've got that lineup, you can get this divergence between the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. So the Electoral College vote favors low population states. And we're now at the point where out of the last 5 elections, we've now had the winner of the popular vote lose twice. Okay, so given this setup, we now have a kind of structural situation in which the Democrats have to win by so much more than Republicans that it's no longer a popular contest. And what you see is that Republicans have received a majority of the popular vote only once in the last 20 years. And yet they've controlled the presidency for 12 of those last 20 years. Okay, so that's to say that when you get a Republican president in the US, it doesn't mean that people have decided, right? If what you mean by that is popular vote. So if you think about 2016 as bad candidate choice combined with the weird rules we've got, you see that the election of Trump doesn't mean you've got this groundswell of opinion, right? Now, the problem is in the US that this is hardwired into a lot of other things. So it's not just the vote for president where you get this anti-majoritarian tilt, but also in our lower house of the sort of national parliament, the House of Representatives, gerrymandering, which means the way that congressional districts are drawn, has consistently, because Republicans control all those little states, right? The gerrymandering has meant that Democrats have to win by, depending on which estimate you look at, between 6 and 8% more of the popular vote nationwide to have a bare majority of seats in the House because of gerrymandering and some other election rules. At the same time, the Senate, again, which represents each state equally regardless of size, also has a Republican tilt, again, because of the way the voters are concentrated at the moment. So Democrats won, handily, lots more votes for the Senate in 2016 and 2018, but the Republicans held a majority during that time. And the Democrats only got, just the bare 50, it's like a 50-50 split now, having won lots more of the votes for the Senate. And then you take our third branch of government, the Supreme Court, and there are now 5 out of the 9 judges, which is to say a workable majority on that court, that were appointed by presidents who lost the popular vote. Okay, so this anti-majoritarianism spreads through like all of US institutions. Now, what do the people think? So this is where I want to say populism is not what's going on here. So here's a survey that was done in the US and elsewhere. You could look at Hungary because Gabor's going to talk about Hungary later. This is the survey that says, so what do Americans believe? So lots of people say Trump won on the basis of white supremacy. Okay. Survey done in the same year asks, You know, does having a lot of different kinds of people, different races, ethnic groups, nationalities make our country better, worse, or not much difference? And in that same year that Trump was elected, nearly 60% of the American public says it makes it better. Okay, so that doesn't mean there were, I mean, all the white supremacists voted for Trump, but that doesn't mean all Trump supporters were white supremacists. And Trump's victory doesn't mean that white supremacy is the dominant view in the US. It's even more dramatic when you look at this, like when you ask, you know, would a system in which a strong leader can make decisions without interference from parliament or the courts be a good or bad way of running the country, right? Straight up support for autocracy. This poll was done in 2017, so Trump had just taken office. The percentage of the American public who want the president to govern alone is 22%. In other words, no support for autocracy, or 22% is too high, right? But this doesn't run the risk of winning elections unless it's really concentrated in odd ways. And by and large, this is true of most democracies. And Hungary, by the way, has roughly the same score as the US on this dimension. 2 years into Trumpism, you know, what about this question? Problems could be dealt with more effectively if presidents didn't have to worry so much about Congress or the courts. Again, it's, you know, about 1/5 of the American public wants that, but everybody else says no. And in the middle of Trump, this is, you know, middle of Trump's term, this is another set of questions. This is the percent of people who think it's important for the country, you know, very important for the country, that rights and freedoms of all people are respected, 84%. That election officials face serious consequences for misconduct, 83%, and on, right? So in other words, there is not widespread support for the thing you think of as Trumpism in the system as a whole when people are asked this question, and it's repeated on survey after survey. This was reflected in Trump's popularity. So this is, if you ask a general public, you know, the question, what is your overall opinion of Donald Trump, right? He never has a majority. He's basically got his solid support is sort of in the 30s. By the way, this is also true of Viktor Orban, whose typical support is in the 30% range in Hungary. Okay, so the question isn't, you can't think of this as the people rising up and wanting autocracy, right? Instead, what you've got are these candidates who aren't very popular, actually, but who manage to take advantage of the electoral rules to win. So let me just run you through just what happened in this last year, and then I'll stop. So this is poll data leading up to the election in 2020. Trump was never ahead, okay, ever. I mean, so Biden had a steady lead. And yet, you know, seeing this coming, and this is where we're really kind of going off the rails. I mean, we've sort of been off the rails. This is really going off the rails. Trump, even before the election, started saying this is not going to be a free and fair election, right? And alarmingly, his supporters agreed with this. This is survey data. This is the percentage of Republicans who think the election won't be fair, August and September, right before the election. Democrats also started to get nervous about this, right? Because Trump is saying the election will be stolen. Trump also started saying, well, if I lose, maybe I won't hand off power, right? This was a famous interview in September where he said, get rid of the ballots and you'll have a very peaceful, well, there won't be a transfer, there'll be a continuation, right? So he starts to indicate that maybe he won't leave. And his supporters, again, you know, here you've got 40, this is Republicans, 40% want him to say, I'm not going to commit to a peaceful transfer of power, right? So Trump being in power did start to move his supporters, but not the public as a whole, right? You still have overwhelming majorities for staying on the rails, keeping the system. The election last November was not close. In the popular vote, Biden got 7 million more votes. That's like the entire electorate of many European countries, right? That's how much more he won the election last year. And this is the Electoral College map. These 5 states, the ones in stripes, were the ones who had voted for Trump the last time and flipped over to vote for Biden this time. And that's why Biden's president. Pretty precarious, actually. It turns out that if about 43,000 votes spread, you know, strategically across those states had been different, we would have had Trump again. Okay? Not because of his massive support. Support's in the 30s, you know, but because of the rules. So, and then, of course, we had the insurrection. So I want to just say that we're now really in danger. And what I said at the beginning, I think, is starting to happen in the US. That basically the autocrats come to power the first time through free and fair elections usually against weak opponents, usually taking advantage of anti-majoritarian elements of the system. And then after they're in power, or after they get a chance to see, you know, can they stay in power with a free and fair election, they start to mess with the free and fair election. So this past year, actually, we managed to have, against lots of obstacles and the pandemic, a free and fair election. Now that's changing. So the battle has moved to the state level. And as I mentioned, you know, the Electoral College elects presidents. The way the US system is designed is state by state by state. Okay, so states choose the system for picking electors for president. And in the 19th century, the state legislators voted for them directly because the Constitution says, the Constitution dictates that electors are chosen, quote, in such manner as the state legislature thereof may direct. There is no individual right to vote for president, and the Supreme Court reaffirmed that in its Bush v. Gore decision back in 2000. So here's a system in which the state legislatures, and again, we have a majority of states dominated by Republicans now, can change the way the rules are run. This was in the last election, just to give you a sense. On the left, you see the state variation in whether you had early voting, in-person voting, all mail ballots, you know, all these different systems. On the right, you see the rules if you wanted to vote by mail, all different. State legislatures are now starting to change those rules state by state. And this is where we are, like, at the moment. The Trump-dominated states are trying to rewrite the state laws to make it impossible for a Democrat to win the next presidential election. Okay, and they're doing that. Well, so that's the bottom line. They're also now, we have a census. They're gerrymandering House districts to make it harder for Democrats to maintain control of the House. They now have a 6-vote majority, so it's very easy to lose. There are new laws being passed, one in Georgia, one in Florida, one in Alabama, one in Texas, that make it harder to vote. And it makes it harder, particularly for Democratic voters in cities who are poor, who don't have documentation, so state driver's licenses and so on, to be able to vote. And new laws are giving state legislatures now the final say on vote counts. So if you have a relatively, you know, decent, and this is what won the election in 2000, we had good election officials. If they decide to actually count the votes and announce the results, increasingly now in these new laws, the state legislature will have to confirm the result of the vote, which means the state legislature can say black is white and white is black, because these laws don't require them to follow what the actual vote was. And to make matters worse, and this has popped up in some of the new laws, election officials are being made personally liable, including with criminal penalties, if it turns out the election count was, quote, wrong. And I put wrong in quotes because wrong may mean reaching the wrong result in some of these states rather than actually, you know, not running a free and fair election. Okay, this is all going on as we speak. It's all been happening since the insurrection, since Trump lost, because he will not lose again, and the Republicans will not lose again. And so what we see, this is where I'm ending, right, is that Republicans are now doing exactly what autocrats do in other countries. They're trying to rewrite the rules of the game to produce permanent minority rule. Because the problem is not populism. It's not that the people want this, right? It's that you have to design the rules to overcome the fact that people actually don't want this at all. And that's why this is not the end. Thanks.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you so much for, well, really painting quite a dire picture, if I may say so, of what is essentially a democratic system which turns out to be not particularly resilient in the face of these attempts to, if not go towards established authoritarianism, in any case, significantly erode some of the basic foundations of democracy in the United States. And on this note, I'm pleased to give the floor to Gabor, who instead will bring us the European perspective, discussing similar parallel dynamics that we see in the European Union, and specifically in the context of Hungary. You have the floor, Gabor.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you for the kind invitation. It's my pleasure to be here, also as a kind of fellow traveler of RECONNECT from the very beginning. So, as you said, I will talk about Hungary not only because this is the country, my home country, which I know the best, but also because I consider Hungary as a kind of model case, a kind of symptomatic case in Europe, especially in East Central Europe, and also somehow a country where the playbook of democratic backsliding or illiberal turn into an authoritarian system has been written mostly by Prime Minister Viktor Orbán. So what we will see in the case of Hungary is partly already with us in other East Central European countries, especially in Poland, but also in Bulgaria, Romania, and nowadays also in Slovenia. So this is a phenomenon already. Similar to Klim, I do not like the framework of populism describing what is happening in this part of Europe, because as we maybe will see, this is not anything to do with the reference to the people or turning to the people as opposed to the corrupt elite. Although the elite was corrupt before the change, but it wasn't the case that Viktor Orbán turned to the people. And proving this, let me follow up the election rules before I start to show my slides about the already mentioned playbook. So the elections, and here, as in the US, there is an original sin. In the US, as we saw, the original sin is the so-called Electoral College, or the system of the election. In Hungary, the original sin has been from the very beginning of the democratic transition in 89-90, is the very disproportionate election system, together with the very easy way of changing the constitution. The very disproportionate election system allowed the Fidesz party, led by Viktor Orbán, in 2010 to gain a two-thirds majority of the seats. But this wasn't a kind of overwhelming majority of the popular votes. Similar to the US, in 2010, Fidesz got 53% of the popular votes, and with that, 67% of the seats in the parliament. And more importantly, this 67%, two-thirds majority of the seats meant, and this is the second sin, constitution-making majority. That meant that Fidesz was able to enact a brand new constitution without announcing this to come before the election in 2010, without any contribution by any of the opposition parties, without consulting with any civil society organization, let alone academic contributions of any kind. So this is the start of this kind of overwhelming majority of the parliamentary seats, which then has been repeated in the next two elections in 2014 and 18, but as also similar to the US, after the change of the electoral rules by the two-thirds majority votes, because this also needs a two-thirds majority in the parliament. So there are several elements of this change. One element was certainly to make the electoral system even more disproportionate than it was in 2010. So as a result of that change, in 2014, Fidesz won the same two-thirds majority with only 45% of the votes. And even in 2018, they got 49% of the votes. So in both cases, the minority of the votes resulted in two-thirds majority of the seats in the parliament. So, and this is the result of the mentioned electoral change. I do not want to go into the details. The changes also covered gerrymandering, similar to the US, winners compensation system, a very unique system that winners get even more mandate that they gained due to the popular vote, authorizing Hungarian citizens outside the country into neighboring countries with a very, very easy way to vote, namely by mail, while not allowing mail voting for those Hungarians living in, for instance, in the US. So when I lived in 2014 in Princeton, I had to go to New York to vote. In 2018, living in Florence, Italy, I had to go to Milan to vote. So these and other kind of rigging made the electoral system certainly not fair, if democratic at all. So let me continue my presentation with the last 11 years of the so-called illiberal turn to the entire constitutional system. I don't know whether you can see my slides. I certainly cannot.
We can see your screen, but not your slides.
And can you see now? Because
yeah.
Okay, so so here is my overview. Although I do not want to talk about all the elements of this kind of illiberal turn from a rule of law revolution in 89-90 into a kind of illiberal constitutional counter-revolution after 2010. Let me only emphasize what are the main characteristics of this constitutional counter-revolution. One is certainly the dismantlement of all the checks and balances on government. And this is what Prime Minister Viktor Orban proudly calls as an illiberal constitution, having no checks and balances on his government. One of the very first steps has been packing the Constitutional Court. And again, if we are talking about the playbook, you can see that the same happened in Poland. The very first target of this this illiberal turn has also been in Poland the Constitutional Court, which was captured by the peace government. This meant not only to elect and nominate new justices and pack the court with government loyal members, but also reducing the competencies of the court. For instance, not allowing the court to deal with economic issues at all. The second important step into a lack of checks and balances was the dismantlement of judicial independence of the ordinary judiciary. You may remember this very famous step back in 2011 to raise the retirement age of ordinary judges, which meant actually the immediate firing of about 1/10 of the Hungarian judges. About 300 justices were sent to retirement overnight, and most of those older justices obviously were court presidents. So the government was able to get rid of the court leaders almost immediately after coming to power. The second main element of this illiberal turn is the dismantlement of fundamental rights guarantees. Already in 2010, the change of the media law, again with Fidesz's 2/3 majority, meant that they stopped any kind of oversight on public broadcasting, filling all these oversight bodies with government loyal members. The other major limitation of fundamental rights was on freedom of religion. Already in 2011, the parliament, again with the 2/3 majority of Fidesz, deregistered about 300 existing churches and introduced a new registration system, a very unique one, in which actually the parliament itself, with its 2/3 majority, is entitled to register new churches. As a consequence, the parliament registered about 1/10 of the previously registered churches. Currently, we have 32 registered churches. And finally, the issue I was already talking about, this is the lack of fair election in the second and the third election after 2010, which was characterized not only by internal academic observers, but also the official European election observer organization, OSCE, as a not fair election. In both cases, OSCE actually came to the conclusion that the state tools using in the election campaigns were overwhelming, not allowing any kind of opposition contribution in campaign possibilities. And not to speak about the already mentioned dismantlement of the free media, which also contributed to this lack of fair election. So let me come to the conclusion. How we can characterize Hungary nowadays. Of course, Hungary, as a member of the European Union, is a very unique member, namely the only illiberal member of besides Poland, of the European Union, not fulfilling all the requirements of being a member of the European Union, not complying with the main values of the European Union, namely being a state governed by the rule of law, or being a state of a democracy altogether. So if we should characterize this state of affairs in Hungary, and similarly in Poland since the change of government in 2015, those two member states, although maybe are not yet autocratic states, but certainly represent a kind of hybrid regime, as it called by the Freedom House yearly evaluation, hybrid regimes with a semi-competitive election system, as I try to characterize the current system, with very limited checks and balances, and with seriously curtailed fundamental rights. So this is my presentation, and I really look forward to the discussion and the reaction by Kim and by the audience. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Gabor, for allowing us to look at these issues through a new lens. I think also in relation to the initial presentation by Kim, which sets us, I think, up very well to connect the dots between what's happening in Europe and what's happening in the United States. And so perhaps before we go back to the audience for the Q&A, and by the way, I remind our audience to send us their questions. There is a definite parallel between what we see in the US and Hungary, and how the rules of the game are being rigged in favor of populist leaders. How do you see, Kim, from a US perspective, the case of Hungary? Is it a cautionary tale in a way, or has the crisis in the US in fact passed because we have a new administration? Biden was elected, and this is all in the past. There you are.
Great, thank you. So I think actually the election is likely to give, the American election is likely to give a lot of people a sense that, phew, we escaped, the worst. But as I tried to say at the very end, what the election did was to infuriate this new Republican Party. And I say new because the biggest transformation during the Trump years was, packing the Supreme Court, but also transforming one of America's two big parties into a party that is overtly in favor of authoritarian rule and overtly in favor of subverting free and fair elections. And that's really new. So the question, really in the US, for me at least, is that we need two parties that are safe. Safe not because they agree with each other, but safe because they agree on the basic requisites of a democratic system, and that they agree that turn-taking in power, which is one of the basic principles of democratic government, parties have to agree to lose. And so we have one party that agrees to lose and one party that refuses to lose. And the party that refuses to lose is now burrowing into state governments, which is where the federal election rules are determined. That's why the system is so strange, right? Because it's not that Congress could override those state rules, at least in part, But right now, there isn't a functional majority in Congress to do that. These state rules are likely to make it impossible for the Democrats to win and make it impossible for the Republicans to lose. And once that happens, you really don't have a democratic system anymore. So that's why I think that, everybody who's concerned about where the US is now needs to start focusing on what's happening in all of these different state legislatures where the election rules are being rigged. Because if the next election, in fact, is predetermined by the rules, then we're really in a situation in which America is no longer a democracy. And that's completely apart from the question of, do we get Trump back again, right? So there's a conversation now happening in the US that maybe Trump was too crazy even for the autocratic Republicans, and that instead there might be another candidate, and the one that keeps coming up is this Governor DeSantis of Florida. And what I worry about with someone like DeSantis is that, unlike Trump, who was too disorganized to actually engage in a lot of autocratic consolidation that was permanent, DeSantis is a very different case. Ivy League pedigree, law degree from a top law school, thinks like a lawyer, which was exactly what happened in Hungary, right? Somebody comes into power and they think structurally and then they figure out how to rig the system. DeSantis is more that kind of guy. So frankly, what I'm worried about is this rigging the rules so that whoever's the Republican candidate will win. And then the current toxic dynamics in the party mean that you've got essentially sort of minority factions in that party determining who the candidates are. And the Democrats are also very likely to put up a candidate that may not have the kind of widespread support that Biden did. So if you have the next presidential election, right, with a candidate picked by the sort of authoritarian wing of the Republican Party up against a candidate that represents one of the edges of the Democratic Party, then what we may get is another authoritarian win, and that one is likely to be more dangerous. So one last point. In Hungary, also in Poland, the real autocratic turn didn't come the first time the aspirational autocrat was in power. Orban had been prime minister from 98 to 2002, and he couldn't do everything he wanted to do because he had to govern in coalition. Ditto with Kaczynski in Poland. It wasn't the first time he was in power that was the real dangerous one. It was the second time, right? So what I'm worried about in the US is the next presidential election and what that's going to look like, and whether an autocrat or someone with autocratic tendencies gets installed at that point, because it's the second time after these structures have been built that I think is the real danger for long-term democracy.
Thank you, Kim, for giving us those additional insights. And we have quite some questions coming in from our audience as well. So perhaps I can start to address some of them, going back to Gabor, perhaps. And I would say, well, first of all, if you could very briefly address the additional variable, let's say, in the European context, which is the European Union, right? And the role it does not, should play in the context of rule of law backsliding. With regard to what is happening in Hungary more specifically, we have a question about the upcoming elections. And so perhaps upcoming in 2022, more specifically, we have Randall Newham, who asked what are the prospects for an opposition victory. So perhaps, Gabor, you could share some insights into that. And then we have a question on what are the main differences you would identify between what's happening in Poland as opposed to what's happening in Hungary. And then I'll come back to Kim with some questions about the US.
Yes, thank you. Maybe I start with the second question, the elections and the possible outcome of the elections, because this is a kind of follow-up what Kim have said about the US prospects. So the paradox situation is that despite the already mentioned rigged election rules, which made always possible for Orban to get even the two-thirds majority with the minority of the votes. So it is not impossible that in 2022 the joint opposition, and this will be the very first time in the last more than one decade that the opposition decided to run in a joint list against Fidesz. So it's not impossible that they can win the simple majority, meaning they don't have the chance to get two-thirds majority, but they can beat Fidesz. The problem with that possibility is that there is this illiberal system entrenched in two ways already. One is a constitutional way of entrenchment, namely with the current and previous two-thirds majority, Fidesz actually entrenched the entire constitutional system. So the constitution cannot be amended if Fidesz gets at least 1/3 of the votes. They can avoid any constitutional amendment. And not only the constitutional rules are entrenched, all the constitutional figures, elected officials, are elected with this mentioned two-thirds majority for 9 years at least. So even with the opposition government, you will have the Constitutional Court fully packed with Fidesz loyalists, the Supreme Court also filled with loyalists, the state prosecutor being a Fidesz loyalist for another 12 years, just re-elected, and all the possible main state position. Plus, Fidesz started something outside the public law or the constitutional law, namely actually capturing not only the state sphere, but also the cultural and the educational sphere of the country. They just privatized all the state universities except 3 universities. They are privatized to Fidesz loyalist oligarchs. This is very much opposed by the European Union, but the European Union did not do anything yet against this very dangerous new phenomena. The only thing they did allegedly, these are rumors in the last days, that they refused to give funds for that privatization of universities. But otherwise, the process is unstoppable, I'm afraid, even in the case of opposition win. Very quickly about Poland. There are a lot of similarities, but there are a lot of differences as well. One of the differences, and this goes to the third question, namely the very reaction of the EU. So from the very beginning, as I mentioned, the Hungarian illiberal turn started more than 10 years ago, while the Polish one started in early 2016. And still, the European Union was much stronger towards the Polish government, triggering the so-called Article 7 procedure first against Poland and not against Hungary. By the way, nothing yet happened with that procedure, but at least it was triggered against both countries, but first against Poland. What is the very reason for that? I guess it's less legal, but rather political. As you may know, the Fidesz government was until very recently, part of the largest fraction in the European Parliament, namely the fraction of the European People's Party, which very much protected Fidesz against any harsh measures of the European Union. While PiS, the Polish governing party, was and still is member of a smaller fraction in the European Parliament, not that much protected by the European political actors. So this is already something which is a big difference, and also somehow explains, namely the political component of this entire issue and the involvement of Germany and the German economic interests to protect Hungary, that I would even say and wrote about that we can call the European Union somehow complicit in this entire illiberal turn, both in Hungary and Poland, and not to take serious measures against those raw governments.
Thank you, Gabor. We have a lot of questions coming in, so perhaps I would ask Kim to address a couple of points very briefly, and then if we have time, there are some more broader questions that perhaps you can both address. There are a few questions with regards to the data that you presented, the polling of voters' views in the context of the last elections in the US, and they all point to kind of questions of how reliable is the data, considering, for example, that we also know that Trump voters are also the least likely to admit that they support Donald Trump. So that's one aspect. And then there is a question that goes towards instead kind of the future of the Republican Party and the recent threats that we've seen in the media about an emergence of a new conservative party. We've seen the debates around Liz Cheney as well recently. And lastly, if what you say is true, that if people in fact don't support Trumpism, despite the fact that all these developments do indeed come to pass, then why isn't there more outcry, considering that in the US, as opposed to Hungary or Poland, there is somewhat at least free media landscape, even if, of course, skewed by all kinds of dynamics in social media and beyond. Kim, a lot to go into, but
yeah, I know those are really great questions. So so first on the data reliability. So pollsters have gotten elections spectacularly wrong in the US, and they're doing a lot of rethinking. And I might say, when I put up all this data, I used to be a public opinion person, so I don't just take stuff off the rack. So here's the issue, that the polling with respect to just asking people's attitudes seems to be, as far as we can tell, probably still reliable when done by some of these traditional media outlets, where they actually are taking more time to actually collect the data. And that's a lot of the stuff that I was giving you. What's been really problematic in data is are these snap polls, where you want sort of a poll every week and you're trying to track this kind of movement in the public. And those tend to have smaller sample sizes. They tend to be done on the cheap because they're being paid for, I mean, anyway, the money for these surveys has kind of evaporated. And so as a result, and also because of the complexity of the US system, what you have to do to get the presidential election right is to have 50 state polls that each get it right? So it's a very complicated business predicting the US presidential election, and that's where the polls have fallen down. There's some evidence, though, that, I mean, the Trump supporters are getting bolder about coming out with their opinions. I mean, certainly we've seen a lot of public demonstrations to that effect. So I think that the kind of data I was presenting, which are longer term surveys done by reliable survey outfits that don't come in from a partisan background, I think are more reliable. And what I find, interesting about that is that this isn't new, that, when you look at the time series, what you see is that there's this kind of rock solid support for the Constitution, of course, but then all of these abstract values that the US Constitution is supposed to represent. Where you get all the political disagreement is in specifically what that means, and that's what a lot of the political contestations are about. So I think that the data at the level at which I presented them are reasonably reliable. Now, as for the future of the Republican Party, that is something that everyone wants to know, including Republicans. So it's clear that the elected party, so the representatives in Washington, the representatives in state houses, people who currently hold public office, have been overwhelmingly falling in line behind Trump as the leader of the party, or Trumpism as the ideology of the party. And that's where the electoral rules are being used to exclude the people who have diverse views from the parties. So, for example, there's a word that used to be a noun that's now a verb, the word primary, and the now verb to primary. So in the US, there's a preliminary stage of voting where candidates within a party compete with each other to become the party's nominee. And then that nominee goes forward into a general election against the other party. And it's mostly a two-party system, of course. What's been happening is that for any senator or any representative, and this goes down to the state level, who has defied Trump, right, who either says the election was free and fair, see what happened to Liz Cheney today, or who says, Trumpism, this guy is an idiot who shouldn't be in charge of the government. If you've taken that view against Trump, then you get primaried, which is to say the party puts up a candidate against you, the moderate, who is an extreme Trumpist, right? And these primary elections are often held off cycle. They're held at weird times. You only get the party faithful who turn out. And that's the small group that actually is much more devoted to Trump. And so these primary challenges can knock out of the running the moderate candidates who have been trying to pull the Republican Party back to the center. And then when you go to the general election, there's that anti-candidate voting thing, right? Which is that there's such political polarization that people who identify as Republicans are much more likely to vote for the Republican candidate, even if they don't like that candidate, than they are to vote for the Democrat whom they think of as the enemy, right? So that's the dynamic that's pulling the party to the far right. It's not popular support, right, in the sense that I was trying to explain. So if that dynamic is going on in the Republican Party, then, the future of the Republican Party is terrible. So the question is, are there enough of these so-called, Republican moderates, or the people I call homeless Republicans, right, who don't have anywhere to go? Are there enough of them to form a party? And that party is likely to move toward the center. Okay, so here's my nightmare scenario. So my nightmare scenario about the Republican Party is that it's going to become more and more extreme, and yet, given polarization, it will still attract enough support to win elections in a tilted system. My other nightmare scenario is that you get the breakout party. So the American electoral system, it's a first past the post system, and for most offices. And what that means is that you introduce a third party and a plurality candidate is going to win. So the question is, which way does the plurality go? So if there are these tendencies in the Republican Party to pull toward the far right, I'm not even sure that's right, toward the autocratic right, let's say. And if there's a tendency in the Democratic Party to pull more toward the kind of social democratic left, a third party is likely to draw from both parties, right? And if that's true, then it could well mean that the far right or the autocratic candidate wins, because the center party will have the effect of weakening the Democrats as well as, anyway. So, I mean, I just don't think a third party necessarily means you get Democratic rule or that the third party wins. the risk of this is splitting the vote on the right and having the Trumpists win again. So I don't think that that's an answer. So as for more outcry, I mean, there's tons of outcry. I mean, I can't tell you the number of meetings I've gone to. I can't tell you the number of people organizing and working and doing this. I can't tell you the state of depression of, big chunks of the American public, and not just people on the left. I mean, my father, who's about to turn 96, is one of those homeless Republicans. And, so, I know people who have felt, disowned by this, Trump party. There's plenty of organization. The problem is, and this is where the comparison with Hungary is so good, a lot of the dysfunctional nature of the American electoral system is hardwired into a constitution that can't be changed by any majority that we can imagine being elected, right? And so if you're stuck with this constitutional framework, and if you can't change the Electoral College, you can't, change the the way the Supreme Court judges are appointed and that they're life terms. So, there's so many things in the Constitution that make this system dysfunctional that nobody feels like that can ever happen, constitutional amendment. So there's plenty of outcry. There's tons of organizing. The Democrats and homeless Republicans together are trying to figure out how to keep Trump from coming back. But given the way the system's structured and given the way all these rules are being changed at state level, again, technocratic, really hard to explain, hard to get out to a general electorate that this kind of rule rigging is going on. Our next elections, including the one, by the way, next year for the House of Representatives and a third of the Senate, those are going to be rigged elections. Okay, and once you're in that ballpark, you're very far from the ability of outcry to affect democratic results. So sorry, that was a long answer, but we're not out of the woods, and I think we're heading into a period of more trouble.
Well, thank you so much for giving us these further insights. Perhaps we can now move to kind of a more fundamental question, which you can both address, which is from Ben Schuckman, who asks, if the underlying problem is that anti-democratic and illiberal candidates are able to rig the rules by using positive legal procedures to rewrite them, then what are the implications for modern constitutionalism? Should constitutions be designed to lock in fundamental democratic values against legal revision? And perhaps relatedly, after you've addressed this question, we can also look at Harry Hummel's question, who points to how there is a need for establishing, or rather asks whether there's a need for establishing new criteria for fair elections, for example, in the context of the OSCE, and what would this revised paradigm look like? How would we do this in practice? And I think the two are kind of connected to each other.
Yeah.
We can start with Gabor, perhaps, or Kim. It's up to you.
Gabor, you go.
So I'm afraid that here the ways of looking the Hungarian and the US system divide. So while I'm pretty pessimistic regarding the US as well, but I don't see the situation hopeless in the US, at least not constitutionally. Or you may say there is hopeless because you cannot change the constitution. In Hungary, we have a very, very serious situation. As I described, the system, this illiberal autocratic system, is so much entrenched that actually an opposition victory would not do the thing, would not change anything. And let me refer to a very recent opinion polls published yesterday by the Alliance of Democracies, which says that 30% of Hungarians believe that they are living in a democratic system. 30% only, which is probably about the Fidesz voters in Hungary. And still, 83% of the people believe in a democratic system, in a constitutional democracy. And 63% of the people think that we should have a more democratic system than we have. And one more data: 72% of the people thinks that electoral fraud is very much likely in Hungary. So what comes out of this? Nothing else, in my view, than a new constitution, a new constitutional constituent assembly. So the first thing a new opposition government can do, call for a constituent assembly and start to enact, to prepare and enact a brand new constitution. Because with this framework of the constitutional system, there is no way to go back to any kind of liberal democratic order in Hungary, at least. In the US, I see more hopes, although certainly something can be done with, for instance, with the captured US Supreme Court, which is captured by not only by the bad rules of having the president the possibility to nominate the justices, and one may say that Trump was very lucky to nominate 3 of them, but this is something which happened even violating the rules twice during the Trump presidency. So one may argue for something packing the court, which I very much oppose in the case of the US, because I do not see the dangers of the constitutional democracy that deep as is the case in Hungary.
I think you're muted.
Can you hear me? I cannot.
Okay, good. Thank you. Alex had muted me, so I couldn't unmute myself. So anyway, that's the wonders of technology. So so I really agree with Gabor that the Hungarian system is completely entrenched, right? And it's entrenched not just because of constitutional rules, but because of the fact that the government made so many ordinary rules entrenched at the level of the Constitution through the creation of what they call cardinal laws. So if the opposition can win the next election, it can't do anything. And moreover, like this whole thing with the public foundations and the privatization of universities, what that's done is to give the next government the power to have a constant source of income that also can't be touched by the parliament. So what I think about Hungary before I turn to the US is that there are these moments when I think that Orban will lose the election on purpose next year, because you've got this united opposition, which has parties from the far right to the social democratic left working together, because given the election rules, the only chance for getting rid of Orban is to have all the parties unite. And they've finally done that. They only agree on getting rid of Orban. If they actually have to govern, I have no idea how they're going to do that. So if they win, it's going to be a mess. Part one. Part two, even if they win, so many things are hardwired. They're certainly not going to win a 2/3 majority. And without the 2/3 majority, it's not just that they can't change the Constitution, but they can't change most of the election framework. They can't change this thing about all these state assets now being run by cronies that, you know, of the government for their own personal benefit. They won't be able to change just a huge number of the rules and all the gatekeepers, right? So the public prosecutor, the state audit office, the media board, the election council. I mean, all of these things are in the hands, and the Constitutional Court, and now the presidency of the Supreme Court, and on and on. All the choke points are held by Fidesz appointees who cannot be gotten rid of by the next parliament. So it's really a locked-in system, and the only way to change it is, I think, what Gabor says, which is a constitutional convention that changes the Constitution. And that process is quite frightening, right? Because you don't know exactly how it's going to be structured, and the opposition doesn't necessarily have enough of a common platform for thinking about that. So I'm worried about Hungary, but I was asked questions about the US. So let me just say a couple of things about that. So one on constitutional change. So this is such a good question, right? Because if you're writing a new constitution, and this might be the option for Hungary, what do you put in to prevent capture, right? So, and this is where I want to say, when the US Constitution was written, you know, 200 and whatever it is, 30, 40 years ago, the US Constitution was the most democratic on earth. Now it's one of the most anti-democratic constitutions on earth because the world changed around it. So when you lock in rules, one of the things you do is you prevent good change as well as bad change. And so it's very tricky to figure out how you design an election system in a constitution. So one of the things I've been driven to is the thought that what constitution should have a lot more of is the regulation of political parties, right? The recognition that parties are institutions of government that need to meet certain democratic criteria in their internal organization, in the way they're governed, in the way they're financed, and in their transparency. So to think of political parties as having to as you know, how to put it, to require of political parties sort of public law guarantees of non-discrimination internally, these kinds of things, then what happens is that when you have the rotation of power through political parties, you have some guarantee that the parties themselves can responsibly govern according to the values in the Constitution itself. Now, as for trying to develop election rules, I don't know, Alex, if you can let me share my screen for one slide, which is slightly funny. So the question is how you design, you know, election rules. And this is where, let's see, I'm just going to try to show one slide here. Right, hang on. So just this slide. And so here's the problem, okay, which is that election systems are incredibly complex configurations of rules. And if you look at OSCE, or you look at the Venice Commission, or you look at anybody else who has tried to develop like model election rules, they tend to develop them like checklists, right? So here's how you draw districts, and here's how big the district sizes should be, and here's how you encourage candidates, and here's how you run election offices, and like it's a bunch of checklists. And those of you who know my work on the Frankenstate know that I'm opposed to checklists. And the reason why is this, right? Which is that basically you can design election systems where every single rule comes from a good government, and the combination is terrible. And this was the combination that the Hungarians used, you know, to rig the election in 2014 and since. They gerrymandered like the Americans, and their defense was, well, the Americans do it and they have a democracy. The district sizes, so the Venice Commission recommends you have district sizes 10% above and 10% with 10% variation, right? So relatively compact variation in district sizes. The way the Germans interpreted that rule was 10% above or 10% below a mean, which means in practice, the district sizes can vary by up to a third, right? The Constitutional Court had held that unconstitutional. The Germans until recently hadn't changed it. The Hungarians used that rule. They used what Hungary used to have to try to keep the parliament more majoritarian, was to have a two-vote rule in districts. So the first rule, all the parties would put up their candidates, and then the top three, I think it was, would go to the second round, right? And then there'd be a vote in the second round. And so there would be coalitions formed after the first vote when everybody could see the strength of the candidates. What the Fidesz people did was to eliminate that first round, so that now you've got all these different candidates standing for election, and Fidesz keeps winning these seats. with 25% of the vote, 30% of the vote, because it's a first past the post rule. And they say that's just like the British. We don't need a runoff. And then the surplus vote stuff that Gabor was talking about, where parties that win majorities nonetheless get extra votes added to their party list votes, was something that Berlusconi had introduced in Italy, and they adopted it in Hungary. And so the system that they created, and this was the defense of it, was that everything looked like it followed some decent rule and some decent democracy, but in fact you got the picture of heaven and hell, as you see on the left.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kim. And as we come towards the end of our event, perhaps I can ask Gabor, is there anything you would like to add in reply? Otherwise, we have more questions from the audience as well. We have a specific, well, more than one specific question on the higher education reform in Hungary and how that plays into the rise of a hybrid regime. So perhaps you could comment on that. And then for Kim again, perhaps you could kind of bring into the picture what the dramatic growth of mail balloting in the US and what its impact on all of these issues that we've discussed, how that plays into this conversation. And then perhaps you could both close with a brief comment on how you see COVID-19 kind of playing a role in highlighting some of these challenges, both in the EU and the US. Whether you see it as just that, or potentially also a catalyst for further change in one way or the other. So perhaps we start with Gabor and then back to Kim again.
Thank you. I had a short disconnection, so I heard your question regarding the university reform. So let me start by explaining this. So together with some other kind of so-called privatization of state assets, state property, Fidesz decided to reform the state-run universities. You have to know that most of the universities in Hungary, except CEU, which was just kicked out from Hungary, and except the just welcomed Chinese Fudan University, almost all the universities has been running by the state. So Fidesz decided to privatize those universities, giving all the property and the assets to that universities to so-called private or semi-private, semi-public foundations. The foundations are designed by law that all those foundations are run by a board, consist of all Fidesz loyalists. So no one else is in the board but Fidesz loyalists. Of course, the ideology behind that is that it's more effective to connect the higher education with the business sphere, but practically that means that Fidesz loyalists own all these universities. And actually, Fidesz also was clever enough before this change to change the constitution and saying that all this property is not public property at all anymore. In other words, neither Hungarian oversight bodies nor European oversight institutions can intervene into the handling of this huge privatization. What does it mean? That all these universities have lost their autonomy. They are run by those boards. The boards decide not only about the business parts of the universities, but also the curriculum. They decide on whom to hire, whom to fire. So that means the end of academic freedom altogether in Hungary. And again, this applies not only to universities, this applies to cultural institutions and partly business enterprises owned by the state previously. The largest oil company, MOL, has been privatized recently the same way. So actually, Fidesz put all the state property into the hands of its oligarchs. I haven't heard other questions, only this first one. So let me know if there were other questions as well.
That's perfect, Gabriel. We're really coming down to the last few minutes of the event. So back to Kim for a final word, and then we'll bring it to a close.
Yeah, if I can just say one last thing about the Hungarian universities, that I think one of the reasons why Orbán did this, I think there are two reasons. One is that he sees that he might lose the next election. And actually, he might see that it would be good for him to lose the next election, because everyone thinks he's a dictator. What's the best way to do that but by losing, and then you see, I lose elections, handing over to an opposition that can't possibly govern in a mess where there's no chance of any of his people being prosecuted or having court decisions go against them or whatever. And then he, majestically sweeps back into power 4 years later, having had a vacation. Sometimes I think that's what he's doing. So if that's true, then it seems to me that one of the things that these universities did was to provide an avenue, because if you look at the new EU plans for the next, multi-year financial framework and the recovery fund, a lot of it is supposed to go to innovation, retraining, things where you could imagine that the EU would love the funds to go through universities. So this is where you're going to have all these universities that are really run by oligarchs. You should not think of them as universities anymore, bidding, and they can put in competitive bids, because it's like tines of a fork, right? That you might have bids from 5 universities, but they're all run by the same circle of people. So the commission will be thrilled because there's competitive bidding, goes through universities, because the commission in its country-specific, the council in its country-specific recommendations tells Hungary to get more college-educated people, do a lot of retraining. You can see where all the EU money was going to be put on that sector. And now what's happened is that Orbán has put that sector out of the control of the government in the hands of his cronies, and it will be a cash cow to protect him while he's out of office. So I know we've kind of run out of time. All I'll just say about mail ballots is that was pandemic. This is what all the rules are going to get rid of. That's what increased the turnout in the 2020 election. This is where all these states are going to roll it back, because now you're supposed to show up in person. And as for COVID, what's striking to me is that because COVID is everywhere, and because good governments have had bad outcomes, bad governments have had bad outcomes, and sometimes good outcomes, the relationship between the pandemic and governance is not so clear. May be true, though, with the vaccine rollout. And this is where Joe Biden has put his, everything on the line by saying, if he can look competent in 2 years, that maybe all of this structural bias in favor of Republicans can be overcome. And maybe he can keep the House, and maybe he can keep the Senate. And a lot of that depends on actually the sort of magic of the vaccine rollout in a country that has no public health infrastructure. As a fully vaccinated person, I can say I'm really grateful, and I hope lots of others are too, and will actually try to get rid of the autocracy that's coming.
And on that note, thank you so much. I must now bring our event to a close, but not before warmly thanking both our speakers for joining us once again for a fascinating conversation. transatlantic conversation, as well as the audience, of course, for participating so actively to this event. Please join the upcoming events organized by the America-Europe Fund at KU Leuven on the 17th of May, 6 p.m. A new transatlantic lecture series will address convergence and divergence in American European views on China. What does it mean for a common transatlantic strategy? And on May 18th, another lecture will instead address new opportunities and challenges for the US and Europe in the fields of security and defense. As always, also please keep following the RECONNECT project on Twitter at RECONNECT-EU and by visiting reconnect-europe.eu, where you will find our latest research and where you can register for the webinar series we're currently running on power and the COVID-19 pandemic, which will run until May 14th. From Kim, Gabor, and myself, it's thank you and goodbye.